All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're basically historical detectives. Our case? Figuring out how the text of the Bible, this book that has shaped so much of our world, actually got to us across thousands of years. Now, this isn't about theology. Think of this as textual forensics. We're going to be piecing together an ancient puzzle from a mountain of clues.
So any good detective starts with the most basic question, right? Where's the primary evidence? Where are the original documents? I mean, the actual scrolls that people like Matthew or Paul or the Old Testament prophets physically wrote down with their own hands, the very first drafts. It seems like a simple question, but the answer is what kicks off this entire investigation.
And here it is, the big twist right at the start of our story. They're gone. Every single one. Not one original document, what scholars call the autographa, has survived. They just wore out from being used, or they were lost or destroyed over the centuries. So that's our central mystery. If the originals have totally vanished, how can we possibly know what they actually said? To solve that mystery, we first have to get familiar with the evidence we do have. And that means understanding the tools of the trade for an ancient scribe. You know, the materials they were using and the kinds of documents they were making. Our most basic clue is the manuscript. And the name pretty much says it all. It's a document written by hand. See, before the printing press, if you wanted a copy of a book, somebody had to write it all out, letter by letter. It was painstaking work. And these handwritten copies, they're like the fingerprints history left behind for us. So what were they writing on? Well, for the most part, two things. First, you have papyrus. It's kind of like an early paper made from a reed plant found along the Nile River. It was the go-to material for the earliest copies, but it's also super fragile. Later on, they upgraded to parchment, which is made from treated animal skin. Way more expensive for sure, but also incredibly durable. And that's a big reason why so many of the later manuscripts survived in much better condition. The format changed over time too. The originals, they were all written on scrolls. You had to unroll this long sheet to read anything. But pretty early on, Christians adopted this new technology called the Codex, and you can just think of it as an ancient book with pages bound together. This was a total game changer. It made it so much easier to find a specific passage without fumbling with a giant roll. And that shift from scroll to codex is actually a really important clue that helps scholars figure out how old these documents are. Okay, so the originals are gone. That's the bad news. But here's where the story takes a turn, and honestly, it's spectacular. While those first documents disappeared, the generations of scribes who copied them left behind an absolute avalanche of clues for us to sort through. Just look at this number, 24,000. When you add up all the New Testament manuscripts we know of, whether they're complete Bibles or just tiny fragments, in all the different ancient languages like Greek, Latin, Syriac, Coptic, the total is over 24,000. It's a truly mind-boggling amount of evidence. And here's a breakdown of that number. We've got over 5,800 manuscripts in the original Greek alone. Then you can add almost 10,000 in Latin and another 9,300 plus in other languages. What this tells us is so important. This evidence doesn't come from just one little isolated community. This was a global movement with people making and sharing copies all across the ancient world. Now this is where it gets really interesting. Let's put that 5,800 Greek manuscript number into perspective. Take Homer's Iliad, a foundational text for all of Western civilization. We have about 650 copies. Or how about the Annals of Tacitus, a critical history of the Roman Empire? For large parts of that work, we rely on just two main manuscripts from the Middle Ages. 2. The amount of evidence for the New Testament just completely blows everything else from the ancient world out of the water. It's not even close. And it's not just the number of clues, it's also the timing. This timeline shows another crucial piece of evidence, the time gap. Our earliest confirmed piece of the New Testament is from around 125 AD. That's maybe just 30 or 40 years after the Gospel of John was written. Now look at most other classical works. The gap between when the author lived and our earliest copy is often closer to 1,000 years. It's an unbelievably short window for the New Testament by comparison. Okay, so we've got a mountain of evidence, an embarrassment of riches. Case closed, right? Well, not so fast. This is where our detective story gets really juicy. Because having thousands of clues is a blessing, but in a way, it's also a curse. Because they don't all say the exact same thing.
You know, the New Testament scholar Bart Ehrman really summed up this central puzzle perfectly. The very evidence we value the most, those super early copies, also gives us our biggest headaches. Here's the deal. In the first few hundred years, Christianity was a small, often persecuted movement. The people making copies weren't always professionally trained scribes. A lot of the time, they were just literate believers doing their best. Now, being closer in time to the originals is amazing, that's the best world, but they also made more human errors, the kinds of mistakes you'd expect. In fact, scholars are pretty certain that most of the little changes to the text happened very early, before 300 AD. So you see the irony, right? Our most valuable clues are also the messiest.
These differences between the manuscripts have a technical name: textual variance. Now, that might sound really dramatic, but a variance can be anything from a simple spelling mistake to a couple of words being flipped to a whole phrase being added or left out. To give you an idea, think about a simple typo. Imagine a tired scribe accidentally writes fro instead of for. Now, if his copy gets used to make 10 more copies and those get copied, suddenly you have a whole family of manuscripts with that tiny mistake. But does it change the meaning of the sentence? Of course not. And the vast majority of these textual variants are exactly like that, minor and easily spotted.
So how in the world do scholars deal with tens of thousands of these variants? How do they sift through all those clues to figure out what the original probably said? This is where the real detectives of our story, the textual critics and their star witnesses, take center stage.
This detective work has a formal name: textual criticism. Now, it's not about criticizing the Bible in a negative way. It's about analyzing it. It's a serious academic science where scholars meticulously compare all the manuscripts. They group them into families based on their shared mistakes, and they use a whole set of rules to figure out which reading is most likely the original one. And these text detectives rely on some incredible star witnesses. Let's meet the lineup. You've got the great Isaiah scroll, an absolutely stunning Old Testament find. There's Papyrus P52, that tiny little scrap that is so important. And then you have the heavy hitters, Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus, two gigantic book-style Bibles from the 4th century that are just masterpieces. And what these witnesses tell us is just profound. The Isaiah scroll was a bombshell. It was 1,000 years older than the best copy scholars had before, and yet the text was practically identical. It proved how carefully the text had been transmitted. P52 showed that the Gospel of John wasn't some late invention. It was being read in Egypt just a generation or two after it was written. And those big codices, Vaticanus and Seneca, they give us an almost complete, crystal-clear snapshot of the whole Bible from a very early and pivotal time in history. So, after all the clues have been gathered, after thousands of manuscripts have been put side by side and every single variant has been weighed and considered, what's the final verdict from our detectives? How close can we actually get to what was originally written?
The number is, frankly, astounding. The consensus among top scholars, like the legendary Bruce Metzger, is that the New Testament text we have today is about 99.5% identical to what the original authors wrote. And that tiny 0.5% that's still debated, none of it affects a single core Christian belief or doctrine.
Let's put that number in perspective just one last time. Homer's Iliad is considered a really well-preserved text from antiquity, and it's thought to be about 95% accurate to the original. The massive Hindu epic, the Mahabharata, is around 90%. By any objective historical standard, the New Testament is simply in a league of its own. That huge amount of evidence allows scholars to cross-reference and weed out errors with a degree of confidence they just can't have for any other ancient book. And that leaves us with a really fascinating final thought. We started this whole investigation with the problem of the lost originals, but after seeing all the evidence, you have to wonder, is a text that's been painstakingly pieced back together from thousands of independent copies from all over the ancient world actually more reliable and verifiable than a single original document would have been? A single document that could have been changed or damaged with absolutely nothing to check it against? It's something to think about.